Many of us were lucky enough to witness the space race in the 1960s. President Kennedy, near the beginning of the decade, challenged our scientists to get American astronauts to the moon and back again safely before the decade expired. Now, while the black and white images of Neil Armstrong stepping off the ladder of the space capsule onto the moon lives and is etched in our memories, there's another memory out of that time that haunts most of us as well. The pilots in Apollo 1 died during a fire in a space capsule while running tests on the launch pad. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee died in horrible, gruesome fashion, and that delayed the space race by a year as investigations were taking place into what had gone wrong. Now, these investigations were taken seriously because a lot of science was being done very quickly, and the astronauts and many of the people at NASA knew that safety precautions were not always being put at the top of the list. And this investigation truly threatened to end NASA's quest for the moon. During the investigation, one astronaut, Frank Borman, spoke to Congress, to the investigation committee, and he declared that the space capsule design was absolutely flawed. And he admitted in the rush to get to the moon, safety had been compromised. But he concluded by saying in his testimony that the real cause of the accident had been failure of imagination. No one had imagined that anything could go wrong while the astronauts were on Earth. They were worried about what could happen during space. And it was failure of imagination that caused the catastrophe of Apollo 1. Failure of imagination was the problem Jesus was addressing as he spoke to his closest followers in Luke's gospel. The first century was not so very different from the 21st century in that the people loved those who loved them and tended to dislike those who disliked them. And if someone slapped them, well, knee-jerk reaction was to slap that person back. We see it on television all the time, right? Somebody slaps somebody and they get slapped right back. Money was to be given only to those who deserved help, and kindness was only to be given to those who deserved kindness. Enemies were enemies, friends were friends, Rome was despised. Now, Jesus' followers were by and large peasants, which meant they suffered more than most at the hands of the Roman Empire, and as a result, they spent a great deal of time complaining and judging anyone who was Roman or anyone who worked or got along with Rome. And who can blame them? Judging and complaining is kind of a favorite pastime for many of us. We enjoy questioning the morals and the sanity of those with whom we disagree. It gives us just that little edge of moral self-righteousness. We judge behavior of human beings and people of faith. We judge their actions as sinful. At the same time, we claim to love them even though they are sinners, as are we. We look at someone's clothing, weight, hair, makeup, manners, and happily find them wanting. We listen to someone's speech patterns, accents, and words, and question their intelligence. We laugh, we get frustrated, we get angry, and we forget completely how to see each other as beloved children of God. Now, we don't call it judging others, we call it people watching. But why do we people watch? Because we find people absolutely fascinating by what they're willing to do in public. And we don't judge them with kindness. We look and say, how can they do that? Ew. How can they go out in public like that? Ew. How can they let their children do that? Ew. You know, we judge, and we kind of rationalize it that we're simply people watching. Yeah, right. And too often, rather than laugh as we judge or complain, we become angry at those who disagree with us, those we consider enemies, and we behave in ways that Jesus found wanting. When someone hits us, well, we hit them right back. Maybe not with fists, but with words and attitudes and conversation with others, otherwise known as gossip. When someone insults us, We not only insult them back, well, if not to their faces, to all of the people we know, and we don't just insult them back, we take down the person, we take down their family, their kids, and their dog. Now, I was sharing ministry with a congregation in Racine when September 11th, 9/11 took place. And that evening at the prayer meeting, I asked what people hoped for and what they feared. The people there that evening hoped that our nation would take time to assess how to respond. Their fear was that our nation would rush into war without reflection. Now granted, nobody quite knew how to respond to that attack on our nation, but they were afraid of what would happen if they hit back. Well, friends, I think we judge, and I think we insult and we get angry and we hit back because of a failure of imagination. Like the congregation in Racine, often we don't want to be judgmental, we don't want to be violent, we don't want to be cruel, but sometimes we just don't know what else to do. We've not learned it takes imagination to behave and believe and respond differently, to do what Jesus asked us to do, to love our enemies, to refrain from taking revenge, and to pray for those who wish to do harm to us. Jesus told his followers, rather than hating their enemies, they should love their enemies and pray for those who persecute them, which takes imagination, friends, because it's so much easier to hate our enemies. It's so much easier to hit back. It's so much easier to take action before we can be harmed. If someone hit them rather than hit back, they should put their hands behind their backs and refuse to strike back. If a Roman demanded something from them, they could give what was asked without any expectation of having their giving paid back. Jesus asked his followers to use their imaginations. Rather than seeking vengeance or revenge against their enemies, they were to return hate with love, pain with peace, and extortion with willingness. Rather than return judgment with more judgment, Jesus invited his followers to imagine offering forgiveness and reconciliation instead. Instead of people watching for the idea of finding them wanting, perhaps people watch for the opportunity to see where we can be helpful. See, when we respond to hate, extortion, judgment, and violence with love, God gives us love, forgiveness, and peace in return. I'm beginning to think perhaps the state of our world is the result of failure of imagination. We want to respond to violence, judgment, and hate in our world in ways that show love, forgiveness, and reconciliation, but we simply don't know what to do or how to do it. We can't imagine what loving our enemies might look like. We try to picture, and we only imagine how if we did show love to our enemies, they would begin to take advantage of us if we did show love. Well, Jesus told us to treat others the way we want to be treated, but how do we get past the fear that others will take advantage of us? I think the only way to imagine loving our enemies is by imagining what it would look and feel like if we risked letting our enemies love us. For instance, how would we respond if ISIS offered to build new bridges and roads for us? How would we respond if the Brewers and the Cubs decided not to play any games this year and just split the wins and losses evenly? We wouldn't like that, would we? How would we respond if delegates at General Conference in St. Louis agreed to disagree and simply get on with ministry? What would happen if political parties in Congress agreed to compromise for the good of the nation rather than fight for each party's agendas? Now, my guess is we would all be incredibly suspicious of the intentions of our enemies if they suddenly began behaving with love rather than hate. And I suspect our enemies would be suspicious of us if we began behaving with love toward them instead of hate. And just a note, folks, loving our enemies does not mean opening ourselves to abuse. Loving our enemies does not mean blindly trusting their actions. Loving those who are toxic or mean does not mean inviting cruelty. It does mean respect and practical trust, things like inspecting a bridge or a road before we decide to use it, and not hitting back. Jesus wants more than our love and our prayers, but he does not expect us to actively invite others to abuse or misuse us, which means we really have to use our imaginations. So today, let's start by imagining what each of us would need to do today to behave in a more respectful, non-attacking, accepting, loving way toward just one of our enemies. And let's face it, we all have them. We all have people we would rather not spend time with. We all have people we think are, if they had the chance, would be out to get us. We all have people who have harmed us in one way or another. We all have somebody we just plain don't trust. So what would happen if we wanted to behave in a more respectful, non-attacking, accepting, and loving way? Maybe it's time to call that family member or write them a genuine letter of care. Maybe it's time to offer the olive branch to a neighbor with whom we're disagreeing by just meeting their demand. Maybe it's time to settle an argument and to ask forgiveness for our impatience, our hurtful words, our mean-spirited laughter, and our judgmental approach towards someone. Who is the enemy in our lives? And what can we imagine doing, saying, or thinking that would show love rather than revenge, love rather than violence, love rather than judgment, love instead of hate? And if we can't think of something, if we find that absolutely unimaginable, perhaps we can ask what we would want those enemies to do to us to show God's love for us. Perhaps our world is the way it is because of a failure of imagination. And Jesus is asking us to imagine how to fix our world by showing our enemies and those who want to harm us and those we like to laugh at and those we like to judge however blandly, showing those folks the love of God ourselves. Just imagine. Amen.